Hi friends. So when we're talking about setting up video equipment, we have to understand what the different types of connections that we're using and why we're connecting the things that we are. So this may seem trivial, but if you take a step back and at any time you're making a connection, you stop and think, what signal is it that I need to send? Where does it come from? And where does it need to go? So the basic rule of thumb is outputs go to inputs. I know that sounds trivial and sounds basic, but if you stop and ask that question, a lot of times you can figure out the connections that you need to make on your own without having to ask me. So what we'll do is we'll go over the different outputs and inputs that we need to connect in order to get things working. And before we really dive into that, though, we probably need to talk about the different types of connectors and different types of cables that we use when we're dealing with professional video. So the first one that I want to talk about is a serial digital interface, or SDI. This cable is a BNC cable, a BNC coaxial cable, and it carries an SDI signal. Professional video, SDI is kind of the default type of connection that we use for everything whenever we can. It's very robust. The connectors actually lock, so they don't pull out won't pull out accidentally. Provides an extremely high quality signal, and it's good for runs up to a few hundred feet. So unless we're making a really long run, we can actually use SDI in order to do that. SDI cables are used very extensively in professional video. Everything in this rack is actually an SDI connection. So that's kind of the basic. Professional cameras, such as this one, will have SDI connections on them. And some of the less professional, some of the more consumer-oriented cameras will actually use something else. So that something else is actually HDMI, and I'm sure you've seen HDMI before. It's probably on your laptop, it's probably on your TV, it's on your monitors, computer monitors, and so forth. You also find it on pretty much all consumer video cameras, and even a lot of professional cameras have HDMI as well. So in addition to having SDI, this camera actually does have HDMI as well. All right, the third type of connection that we actually deal with is fiber optic. And in this case, it's over this blue connection. And if you look at this, there's two wires there. And the reason there's two wires is because this actually sends two signals, not just one. So when we're using fiber optic, we're able to do everything over one cable assembly instead of running two separate ones. If we were to use SDI for the type of work that we're doing, if we were to use this instead, we would actually have to run two cables, one for signals in each direction. Fiber optic, it is carrying an SDI signal. It's just over an optical connection. These cables actually have a glass fiber in the middle that transmits light, and that's how they communicate. And because they are glass fibers, the cables are somewhat delicate, and we need to make sure that when we're running the cables, that we place them outside of walking areas or other places they might get damaged, such as in a door jamb, where if the door closes, it pinches the cable. We want to make sure that we avoid that at all possible costs. These blue cables are a slightly different variation on an optical cable. These are what we call armored. So outside of the glass fiber, there is actually a metal sleeve that helps to protect the cable. That said, it's not infallible, and the cable still can be damaged, and we still need to exercise caution. The other thing about optical cables is they don't work well when they have a tight bend radius. So if you're gonna wind up a cable, make sure that you don't wind it up any more tightly than a few inches in diameter, because the light will not travel well around corners. Light doesn't like to travel around a corner, so it's better to keep the cables relatively straight if you possibly can. So with that said, those are the three main connections that we actually use, and we can dig in and talk about how those connections are used and where we use them. So each one of the cameras that we deal with has a gray bin like this, and this bin contains all the stuff that we need to use in order to connect up the camera. The first and most important part of what's inside the bin is this device here. This is what we call a camera converter. So you can see all the different connections that are on there. This has the connections for going to and from the switcher via the optical connection, which is this one down here. It also has connections for going to the cameras, so either SDI or HDMI, depending on which camera and which monitor we're using. This is the central device in making sure that all of this works. It also provides the connections for the intercom as well, so when we want to talk to one another, the signal actually travels through this box. Typically what we'll do with this is attach it to the tripod so that it's easy to get to, but out of the way. Another alternative is to actually wear this on your belt. So if you happen to be assigned to run a roving camera, you can place on a pocket, on a belt, and so forth, and then just run the single cable. So that's the first thing that's in the bin that we need to worry about. All right, next we have a headset for intercom. We'll talk more about how to connect that up. We have power adapters. So this first power adapter is actually for the camera converter itself. You can tell this one from other ones because it has a shorter cable. The cable's only about 6 feet long, so it's a little bit shorter than the other ones. This one won't reach to the monitor, and you shouldn't use it for the monitor anyway. Then there will be a power adapter for the monitor. This one's a little different than the others, but each one of the bins does have a power adapter for the monitor, so we can run it off AC power instead of battery. We have an AC power cable. This is 8 feet long and it has 3 outputs on it. We'll actually use all 3 of those. One for the camera, one for the camera converter, and one for the LCD monitor. And the next thing we have in here is an actual LCD monitor. This one's actually an OLED, but you get the point. So each one of these bins has a monitor for placing on top of the camera, so that the camera operator can monitor what's going on. All right. So with that said, each one of the different cameras that we're working with has different connections on it. So this camera right here, this is a 4K camera. Let's see. Let me actually, there we go. All right, so this is one of my 2 4K cameras. You can tell it's 4K because it's got the big 4K here on the side. It has a couple other differences to some of the other cameras too. For example, there's another one that looks very similar to this, and I'll cover that in a minute. And you can tell from this side because the 4K camera has these air vents because the electronics actually get hotter inside because it's processing more video. So the other camera doesn't have these air vents on it. My 2 4K cameras are numbered 7 and 6. So if you're setting up a camera, you can always tell if it's one of the 4K ones by looking at the number on the side. If it's 6 or 7, it's 4K. And the 4K cameras have an SDI connection for the video output on the back. All the rest of the cameras are going to use HDMI instead. The HD version of this camera, this one right here, it's called an NX cam. It's NX100, Sony NX100. It looks basically identical. It looks basically identical, but it's actually a little bit different. So instead of saying 4K on the side here, it actually says NX cam. This camera does not shoot 4K. It's only high def. And as I mentioned earlier, on the right side, there's no air vents. There's also a little bit of a difference up top. On this one, it actually says NX cam, whereas this one says XD cam. So you can tell the two apart that way. The dangerous thing about setting this one up is that on the back, it has a connection that looks like SDI. It's the same connector as SDI, but that's actually a standard def, and so we don't use that. So when we're hooking up this particular camera, the NX100, we use HDMI instead of SDI. The other camera that we use is a Sony V1U. These are cameras numbered 3, 4, and 5. NX cameras is 8, by the way. These cameras number 3, 4, and 5. These have an HDMI connection on the side behind this flap. So in order to connect this camera, we'll use HDMI, and that connection comes out the side instead of the back. All right. So with that said, let's actually talk about how we make the connections. So first thing I like to do is to mount the camera converter box, because that's how we're going to determine how the cables are routed. So I'm going to grab a roll of tape here. Normally you'd use wider tape than this. This is just what I happen to have handy. So I'll take a piece of tape here. It's about roughly 8 inches long. And tear that off. And then what I'll do is I'll actually place it underneath the belt clip that's on the camera converter. So slide it underneath there, and then when I go to connect it to the tripod, wrap one piece of tape around the back, and then wrap the other piece of tape around the first one, and that will secure the camera converter to the tripod. From there, we can actually start making connections. The first connection we need to make is our fiber optic. There we go. All right, so our fiber optic connection here, this blue cable, usually it's either blue or yellow, will just slide up and snap into the optical in-out jack on the device. At this point, I like to turn the device on. There's the power button is up top. You press and hold it. And I know you can't see it from where you are. That will light up on the top. And you can see if you're getting a signal back from the switcher over this connection, if there's a little light on top that says optical, whether that light is lit up in green or not. If it doesn't light up, then you're not getting a signal, and we need to check the fiber connections to make sure that that's actually working properly. With the fiber connected, we can actually start connecting up the camera. So I've actually got this camera already turned on. I'm going to flip out the LCD panel here, and you can see that the camera's on and currently active. So at this point, this is where we're going to grab one of our different video cables in order to connect the camera up. With these 4K cameras, the Z150 model, we're going to use SDI. So if I grab one of my SDI cables here, and connect that to the SDI output on the camera, and then connect the other end to the SDI in on the camera converter. And if we've made that connection properly, we'll actually start to see video on the switcher. So at this point, we're actually sending video from the camera to the switcher. The next connection we're going to be making is for the monitor. Before I get to that, I mentioned that the other cameras use HDMI, so I'll actually show you how that connection is done. So I'll remove the SDI cable here, and I'll grab the HDMI. So HDMI plugs in the back of the camera, and then the other end plugs into the HDMI in on the camera converter. In this case, we're not going to get any video because this camera is set to currently not output anything through the HDMI. This camera is only set to use SDI, so we won't see any video at the moment. But for the cameras that use HDMI, that's how that connection will be made. All right. So we have video in order to. If we have, having a hard time talking. So we can connect the SDI cable back up here, so we actually have video while we're working with this. All right, with that, we do have the video coming through on camera 2. You can see back here, and we can start working on connecting the monitor. All right, a couple different monitors. There's one of these. This is AC7. This is a much more professional, higher-end monitor than the others. So I typically put this on camera 2 in the middle, and that's connected by connecting this thing that's called an Israeli arm, which is pretty cool. You can adjust the Israeli arm by loosening this knob and then position it any way you want. So I just kind of position it so that the monitor is a little bit farther back than the connection on the top of the camera, the hot shoe. Tighten that down, and then slide that onto the shoe of the camera, and then tighten it down with a thumb screw. So with that done, we actually have the connection, or we actually have the monitor physically attached to. I'll get a shot of that here. Physically attached to the top of the camera. So let me reduce the exposure here. Okay. All right. So with that physically attached, we need to actually make the electrical contacts. So inside the bin, there is going to be a power connection for the LCD monitor. For most of them, it looks more like this, but it has a long cable on it. In this case, this one's a little bit different. So we'll run this cable. I like to run it through the microphone shotgun microphone holder, and then plug it into the camera. So the microphone holder just kind of keeps the cable out of the way and keeps it from getting in the shot. All right. The next connection we're going to make is a video connection from the camera converter to the monitor, so we can actually see video. Again, we have two different ways this is going to be done. On most monitors, that's done with HDMI. On this monitor, however, that's actually done with SDI. And it seems I've misplaced my other SDI cable. All right, so I'll connect this one over HDMI because that's more similar to the others anyway. Normally, this particular monitor would be connected with an SDI. So what we'll do here, we'll connect to the HDMI out on the camera converter. We'll run that cable through the microphone shoe and then run it over to the HDMI connection and plug that in. So, all right. Okay, now we're ready to power everything up. So, grab our AC power cable. In a lot of situations, this 8-foot cable is maybe long enough to connect to a nearby outlet. If not, we grab an extension cord, and we still use this because it has a 3-way splitter. So I'll plug that into a power source, and then start plugging in the various devices. So first connection I'll make here is going to be the monitor on top of the camera. Then we're going to connect up the camera converter, which just plugs in here on the right side. And I don't have one handy, but the third connection will be power for the camera. The camera power connectors on all models are on the lower right corner. So we just plug that in there. All right, now, as you can see right now, we're not getting a signal at all. And that's because this monitor is currently set to the SDI input. Let me navigate the menu here. So I'm going to select the HDMI input because that's the one we actually have connected. So when I select that, we should actually start to see video. There we go. So now we see some video on there. And let me reduce the exposure a bit here so you can see better what's on there. So top left is camera 1, bottom left is camera 2, which is the one camera we're currently looking at. Upper right is camera 3, and bottom right is the program feed or whatever is currently live. So those 4 sources can be customized. I can select different things. So if we're dealing with let's say a 2-camera setup, and instead of having camera 3 in the upper right, we could put computer graphics up in there. Or if we had 4 active main cameras, we could put camera 4 in the lower right instead of putting the program feed there. So with that, the primary connections are already done. At this point, all we have left is the auxiliary connections, such as the intercom. In each one of these bins, there is a headset. And on the headset, we have 2 different types of connections. So this is one. This is a single connection, and the other headsets have 2 connections. In the case of those that only have one, that will go into, let me move the camera here, get a better shot of this. Okay, so the headsets that have a single wire connection will go in the headset jack on the right. I apologize for the camera not being focused, so I don't have control over that at the moment. All right, and for the headsets that have 2 connections, one will be green for the headphones, and that will go in the headphone jack, and then the one for this red is for the microphone, and it goes in the microphone jack. So those are the primary connections there. The only other connection we need to worry about at the camera level is what we call the zoom controller. This tripod doesn't have one, but most of the tripods do. It's a little device that sits on the handle and allows you to control the zoom function of the camera. It also allows control over focus if you're doing manual focus. So there will be a cable coming out of the zoom controller that plugs into the lower left on the 4K camera, as well as the NX cam. On the V1U, that connection is up top right. It's this little tiny blue jack on the upper right corner of that camera. With those connections made, the cameras are ready to go. I don't need to worry about any other connections at the camera location. So I'll go ahead and pause the video here, and I will go through some of those connections on a different camera with a different monitor. Okay, so now we can talk about the differences with some of the other cameras. So the last video we covered hooking up the 4K Sony Z150 cameras. The other ones are a little bit different. That one has, the Z150 has SDI, whereas these other ones only have HDMI. So at this point I've gone through the point where I've connected up the power and the fiber optic connection on the camera converter here, but we'll go ahead and make the rest of the connections on the video. So whereas with the previous connection, the previous camera, we made the connection with SDI. This camera, because it only has HDMI, we're going to use the HDMI connection on the camera. So first connection we'll make here will be the HDMI output on the back. So let's go ahead and push that in there. On the V1U, which is the other camera we occasionally use, the HDMI connection is on the left side instead of the back, but otherwise the same. Then we'll take the other end of the HDMI cable and plug that into the HDMI input on the camera converter. Now if I power that camera converter on and power on the camera, we should actually start to see video. Now there we go. So camera 2 input here, we're actually getting video from the camera already. So let's turn the gain down on that a little bit so the picture's actually recognizable. All right, so at that point we've actually got the video coming from the camera, going through the camera converter, over the fiber optic cable, over to the switcher. The next thing we need to do is to hook up the monitor. These monitors are a little bit different than the last one I showed. These ones, first of all, only have an HDMI connection, but the other thing is these actually have sunshades built into them. So when I go to open the front of the monitor, you'll see that the sunshade automatically pops open. That'll be useful if we're shooting outdoors or if there's a bright light that happens to be shining on the camera. The physical connection to the camera is usually done using this little adapter that's included in the monitor case. There is a 1/4-inch screw and then a little peg to make sure that it doesn't rotate. So we just put that on the bottom, screw it into place. From here, this is where we can actually connect it to the camera itself, and that goes on the shoe on the front. The NX cam, like this, only has a front shoe, as does the V1U. The 4K camera has a rear connection as well, so if we wanted to move the monitor a little bit closer to the back, we can do that. So with that, we have the physical connection between the camera and the monitor, and at this point we start to make electrical connections. I mentioned in the last video that each one of these bins has a power cable for the monitor, and as you can see, this cable is actually quite a bit longer than the power cable for the camera converter. So I'll just plug this in and then run the cable up through the shotgun mic holder and then make the connection to the DC input on there. At this point there, we can turn the monitor on. There's a switch on the upper right side, and as you can see, we've got blue video coming through. The blue basically tells us we don't have a video signal. In order to get the video signal, this is where we make another HDMI connection. So I'll grab that other HDMI cable and connect one end to the HDMI out on the camera converter, and then I'll run that cable also up through the shotgun mic holder just to hold it in place, and then connect that to the HDMI input on the monitor. So with that connection made, there we go. Now we see the 4 video sources on that monitor as well. So let me pan up to that so you can see that. So there you go. So there's the 4 video sources coming through on the monitor at the camera. All right. The remainder of the connections are actually the same. So there's a zoom controller, we'll connect that. The headset jack, this is one of those that has the 2 connections, as I mentioned. There's actually a third one that's for USB, that we don't use that. So we take the 2 connectors. One has a green ring, the other has a red ring, and we plug the red ring into the microphone jack and the green ring into the headphone jack. At that point, communication with the base space station should be working. And in order to talk back to the director, you press the PTT button on the camera converter, and then you can have a conversation. So if you need to ask a question during a production or whatever, you can do that. So other than that, everything else is the same as the other camera that we set up. So in this case, we're just using HDMI instead of SDI. One other advantage this particular monitor has is it can take a battery as well. So if we needed to set up a camera somewhere where power is not available, the camera converter, the camera itself, and the monitor can all run off of batteries. The camera and the monitor both use the same Sony L series batteries. In the case of the monitor, you just slide it into the holder on the back. The cameras themselves, the battery holder is on the back. You just push the battery and then slide it down and click it into place. So with that, that should be all the connections that we need to make in order to get the cameras up and going. So thanks for watching.